The night began the way unforgettable hospital nights often begin, with bright lights reflecting off wet floors, raised voices colliding beneath fluorescent glare, and one person in the room seeing the danger long before anyone with authority was willing to admit it. Rain hammered the awning outside St. Catherine Medical Center in Charleston when the ambulance doors opened, and the trauma team swallowed the stretcher whole. The man being rolled in was broad-shouldered and heavy with rainwater, dressed in soaked civilian clothes, his skin gone ash-gray under the trauma bay lights. Monitors started protesting before the stretcher was even locked in place. His blood pressure was falling in a pattern too fast to ignore, his heart rate was climbing, and his oxygen saturation kept stuttering in uneven, ominous little drops. Around him, the room assembled itself with the speed and confidence of practiced emergency medicine. But beneath that speed, something more dangerous was already forming. People were choosing the story they wanted before the patient's body had finished telling them the truth. Dr. Adrian Pike arrived with his usual forceful momentum, a man who carried authority the way other people carried tools, visibly and with the expectation of obedience. His white coat moved behind him like a flag of ownership as two residents trailed close, eager and tense, trying to mirror his urgency. The paramedic report came quickly. Male, mid-40s, vehicle rollover near the Ravenel approach, restrained driver, possible chest trauma, mental status waxing and waning, scene details limited by the extraction conditions. The patient tried to raise one hand and failed. Water dripped from his sleeve onto the sheet. His lips moved, but no one except the person at the foot of the bed was paying attention to the right things yet. Mara Vale was already gloved, already assessing, already noticing what the louder people in the room would miss. She saw the distended neck veins, the too fast breaths that were shallow in a way panic could not explain, the narrowing pulse pressure that signaled something more specific and more lethal than ordinary trauma shock. She knew the pattern before it had a name in the room. Mara spoke quietly at first, the way she always did, calmly noting that the patient's chest was tight and that this did not look like shock alone. One resident glanced at her and then at Pike, as if permission had to be granted before her observation could be considered real. Pike barely acknowledged her. His dismissal came with the polished contempt of a man who believed hierarchy was not only useful but sacred, especially when someone lower in it threatened to be right in public. Mara did not react outwardly. She cut away the patient's soaked shirt with steady hands and watched him wince under a pressure he could feel even if he could not describe it. Bruising marked the sternum, but not enough to explain the way he was trying not to move, as though even breathing carried risk. The monitor alarm changed pitch by only a fraction. To most of the room it would have been noise. To Mara it was warning. She asked for ultrasound, more firmly this time. Pike brushed her off again, insisting the patient needed imaging rather than theatrics. Then the patient turned his head toward Mara as though her voice had reached him from somewhere distant and safe. His eyes opened just enough to find her face, and he whispered a single word that froze her for half a heartbeat. He called her Wren. The word struck Mara with the force of old memory because no one in Charleston was supposed to know that name. Pike heard it and dismissed it as disorientation. The blood pressure dropped again. Mara looked from the monitor to the patient's neck veins to the silent ultrasound machine parked only a few feet away, and in that brief span of seconds she made a decision that would cost her almost everything by morning. She stepped past a resident, seized the machine herself, and drove it hard to the bedside. Pike turned in disbelief and demanded to know what she was doing. Mara answered with the same calm she used for everything, but this time the calm landed like defiance. She said she was saving him. That was the moment the room changed, though none of them fully understood it yet. The machine powered on. Gel hit skin. The probe touched the patient's chest. Grainy grayscale shapes resolved into a picture that transformed the entire scene from disagreement into proof. Fluid where there should not have been fluid. Compression where there should have been motion. The right side of the heart struggling against pressure it could not overcome. Tamponade, the kind that kills while people argue. Once the screen forced reality into view, hierarchy tried to recover itself. Pike moved quickly, reclaiming the procedure plan, ordering a pericardiocentesis kit, calling for cardiothoracic backup, and restoring the clipped cadence of command. But the damage to the old balance had already been done. The residents had seen who found it first. The trauma tech had seen who made the call. The paramedic by the door had seen what nearly happened because someone important did not want to be corrected by a nurse. The patient drifted, gasped, and then whispered Wren again, clearer this time. One of the residents noticed and asked if he had just used her name, but Mara did not answer because the blood pressure was crashing and there was no time left for anyone's curiosity. She called for O-negative blood. Pike objected on reflex, insisting they verify first. Mara refused to yield to his comfort when the patient was running out of physiology. The monitor proved her right before the argument had even ended. The pressure collapsed. The rhythm faltered. The room compressed into pure action. Mara hit the emergency blood release, elevated the bed, adjusted the screen, set the sterile field, relayed the vital signs, and moved with the kind of exacting muscle memory that comes only after fear has long ago lost its usefulness. Pike asked for the needle, and she had it in his hand before the final syllable left his mouth. Dark fluid returned. Pressure began to rise. The patient dragged in a breath from somewhere deep. One resident whispered a stunned. Mara cut through it with a reminder to stay focused. Even after the immediate crisis bent in the right direction, Mara did not stop. She kept scanning because trauma never promises there is only one disaster at a time. She moved through the belly, the pleural spaces, the hidden places where a second catastrophe waits for everyone to relax too early. Then she found free fluid where there should have been none. There was abdominal bleeding too. She said they needed the operating room now. This time Pike did not contradict her. Transport thundered down the corridor under stark white light while rain hammered the windows. Mara ran alongside the stretcher, pressure on a line, eyes on the patient as he drifted in and out. At the elevator, two men in dark civilian jackets appeared from the opposite hall with the controlled speed of people who knew emergencies but not necessarily hospitals. One spoke into an earpiece. The other took one look at the patient and went rigid. He identified him as Commander Elias Rourke. The name changed the air. Pike heard it. So did everyone nearby. The unknown rollover patient was not a random civilian but an active-duty Navy SEAL officer, and judging by the men closing in on the elevator, a man whose name did not usually enter public hallways without consequences. Pike straightened almost visibly, already recalculating his posture. Mara kept her eyes on the patient. Rourke found her one last time before the doors shut and managed a whisper about still hearing it, as if her voice were the thing he had recognized even before her face. The operating room swallowed him for hours, and the emergency department did what emergency departments always do after drama. It kept moving. New patients arrived. Old patients worsened. The floor still needed mopping. Paperwork bred in stacks. Monitors cried for attention, yet beneath the routine ran a live wire of gossip. People whispered that Mara had found the tamponade, that she had overruled Pike, that the patient knew her, that he was military, that he had called her Wren. Nobody asked her directly. They said everything within earshot instead, which in a hospital is often the crueler choice. Charge nurse Leela Mercer approached with the pinched expression she wore when power might need protecting and warned Mara that she could have created a major legal issue. Mara answered that she had created a living patient. Leela told her not to get smart. Mara reminded her that she was not the one who had delayed the ultrasound. That made Leela's face harden in the bureaucratic way that promised later consequences. At 1:07 in the morning, the operating room called up with confirmation that Commander Rourke had survived. Cardiac tamponade drained, abdominal bleeding controlled, transfer to ICU underway. A resident who had heard everything admitted with visible reluctance that Mara's reads had both been right. Before the moment could settle, Pike emerged from the physician workroom with the clipped confidence of a man constructing a safer version of events. He thanked the team. The word felt like theft. He praised rapid physician action, praised coordination, praised the system, and never once said Mara's name. Then, to cauterize any memory that she had challenged him and been correct, he told her that in the future she would wait for attending direction before initiating diagnostic escalation in his trauma bay, and that everyone had merely been fortunate her enthusiasm aligned with the proper course. Mara repeated the word fortunate as if testing its bitterness. Pike confirmed it without shame. St. Catherine loved procedure most when procedure shielded power. By dawn, the story had hardened into two competing versions. Among techs, medics, and the few honest residents, the version was simple. Mara saw the danger, Pike ignored it, and a man was alive because she refused to stand down. The official version traveled faster because administration clothed it in respectable language. A nurse had overstepped in a high-profile trauma case. Resources had been activated prematurely. Confidentiality might have been compromised once the patient's identity became clear. Chain of command had not been respected. At 7:12 that morning, Mara received the formal expression of that version in her inbox, a mandatory meeting notice. She had been on her feet all night. Her coffee had gone cold twice. Her scrubs still held a trace of rain and antiseptic. She entered the conference room near the staff elevators and found Pike already seated with Leela Mercer and Evan Coates from Risk Management, a man whose entire appearance suggested he had been constructed to reassure lawyers. The room was too warm. The sunlight pressing through frosted glass looked weak and jaundiced. Coates invited her to sit in a tone polished enough to imply injury in advance. Pike set a file on the table like evidence. They explained they needed to discuss her conduct during the trauma response. Mara answered plainly that her conduct had saved a patient. Coates asked for constructiveness. Mara asked for whom. Pike outlined his accusations, initiating ultrasound without physician direction, challenging direct orders in front of junior staff, releasing emergency blood without attending authorization, and according to witnesses, addressing the patient with undue familiarity. Mara corrected him. The patient had addressed her. Pike called that irrelevant. Mara said it was the point. He insisted the point was that she behaved outside her role. Mara, exhausted but sharp, replied that if they were interested in roles, then his role had been to recognize tamponade. Coates drew in a breath. Leela stiffened. Pike's gaze flattened into something colder. He accused her of finally letting her supposed humility crack. Mara thought, though did not say, that humility was always the preferred word of insecure people in power. Coates slid the paper across the table. Pending review, she was being placed on administrative suspension for insubordination and protocol deviation. Temporary, he said, while they assessed exposure. That word told her everything. Not harm, not patient outcome, exposure. She listed the facts anyway. She had charted her concerns. She had requested ultrasound twice. She had asked for blood because the patient was crashing. Each statement was met with the same bureaucratic shield. They would review the chart, review the timeline, review the resource usage. Mara asked what would have happened if she had waited. No one answered because the answer was obvious and unsayable. Pike then delivered the line that clarified the entire meeting. He said this was what happened when clinical support staff began imagining themselves as decision-makers. The words were meant to wound. Instead, they revealed. Mara saw the shape of the institution in that sentence more clearly than she ever had before. She signed the suspension acknowledgement without drama, placed her ID badge on the table, and left with the same composure she brought to every room. The humiliation did not stay confined to the meeting. By the time she crossed the nurses' station, everyone knew. Some people looked at her with sympathy too frightened to become visible support. Others avoided her entirely. One young intern, not yet old enough to recognize cruelty in administrative language, whispered to another and wondered what she had expected would happen. Mara heard him and kept walking. In the locker room, she changed into jeans and a charcoal sweatshirt. In her locker, among spare scrub caps and a folded rain jacket, the small black pouch holding the worn brass coin sat exactly where she had left it. She curled her hand around it for one brief moment, then returned it to the shelf. Outside, the rain had stopped, and Charleston morning had that rinsed, pale brightness that makes even beautiful brick buildings look newly tired. Delivery trucks moved along the curb. A church bell rang somewhere down Meeting Street. Mara stood under the awning with the suspension letter folded in her pocket. She expected rage and found something older instead, something she had trained herself to master years ago in harsher places. Distance settled over her shoulders like a protective layer. It sharpened thought, steadied breathing, and made sequence possible. She replayed the case: arrival, vitals, neck veins, ultrasound, blood, or witnesses, charting. Then she replayed the whisper that mattered on a different level entirely. Ren. Elias Rourke had recognized her through years, different hair, civilian clothes, half-conscious shock, and all the camouflage of a rebuilt life. That was not coincidence. That was a fuse. By noon, 2 nurses had texted to ask whether she was all right and to say the situation was insane. Mara replied to both with the same short instruction: keep your notes. At 1:18, an unknown number called. She let it ring several times before answering with only her last name. The man on the other end identified himself after a pause. Commander Rourke was awake, he said, and asking for her by call sign. Mara went silent. When she asked who was speaking, the answer came with military precision. Captain Jonah Velez, Executive Officer, Naval Special Warfare Liaison in the matter. The phrasing mattered, not in his recovery, in the matter. Mara said she was suspended. Velez replied at once that this situation seemed likely to change. Mara recognized something beneath the older, rougher voice and tested his first name. The silence on the line confirmed her guess. He was one of the younger officers from long ago, older now but unmistakable in cadence. He admitted remembering her. She said she remembered everyone who kept their head, and he almost laughed. When she asked what Rourke wanted, Velez said he suspected the commander wanted the people trying to bury the facts to hear something from him before those facts were diluted beyond usefulness. Mara did not go straight back to the hospital. Emotion was expensive, and she knew better than to spend it before necessity. She went home first, showered, slept 90 minutes, made coffee, ate half a piece of toast, and sat at her kitchen table with a suspension letter, a legal pad, and the kind of memory that stores details other people discard. She wrote the timeline from memory before checking the chart app. Arrival at 9:18. First request for ultrasound at 9:20, dismissed. Second request at 9:22. Scan initiated at 9:23. Tamponade visualized at 9:24. Blood pressure crash at 9:25. Emergency blood release at 9:26. Procedure prep. Elevator to OR. Survival update after 1 in the morning. Then she made the more important list: witnesses, paramedic Rays. Resident Chen, Trauma Tech Holloway, Blood Bank log, ultrasound timestamp, or intake, security camera near the elevator. At the bottom, she wrote the line that mattered for reasons beyond medicine. The patient identified me before anyone identified him. When she finished, she looked around the apartment she had constructed to be deliberately simple. Narrow sofa, running shoes by the door, shelf of books, no television, no framed achievements, no evidence of a prior life except the cedar box on the closet shelf. She brought it down and opened it. Inside lay the life she did not discuss. A folded unit patch sealed in plastic. Commendation letters blacked out in places. A photograph turned face down. Old dog tags. A matte challenge coin engraved with a bird in flight. Ren, she touched nothing longer than necessary. The box was not for nostalgia. It was for remembrance without surrender. She closed it again and returned it to the shelf. When Velez called at 4:40 and said Rourke was stable, coherent, and asking the same question more forcefully, Mara finally agreed to come. She made one objection about not worsening matters for his command. Velez noted the concern and moved past it, the way officers do when the important decision has already been made. Returning to St. Catherine in civilian clothes through the side employee entrance changed the hospital's texture entirely. It no longer felt like the place where she worked. It felt like contested ground. Security checked a screen, looked at her clothes, and let her pass with the awkward respect reserved for people who have suddenly become part of an internal scandal. ICU was dimmer, quieter, more exacting. Ventilators hissed in neighboring rooms, infusion pumps clicked, and footfalls softened into whispers. Jonah Velez waited outside room 12 in plain clothes, silver just beginning at his temples, broad-shouldered and still too alert for any civilian hallway. Their greeting was characteristically unsentimental. He told her she looked shorter. She told him he looked older. He approved of that exchange as if it proved they were both still functional. Two other men lingered nearby with unmistakably military stillness. Neither interfered. Velez told her Rourke was coherent enough. When she asked why the commander had not identified her earlier, Velez said he had been busy not dying. Through the window, Mara saw Elias Rourke propped slightly upright, pale against white sheets, one shoulder bandaged, the hard, unbreakable lines of command temporarily erased by injury, so that for a moment he looked simply human and fragile in the wrong light. Then his eyes shifted to the glass, and recognition passed between them as sharply as if no time had intervened at all. Inside the room, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and warmed plastic. Harbor twilight leaked through the edges of the blinds. Rourke looked at her with exhaustion and certainty, as if confirming not only her presence, but an entire category of trust. He indicated that she was real and present, and she answered with dry inconvenience rather than emotion. He observed that she always seemed to arrive where people least deserved her. She asked how he had recognized her. He listed the small habits she still carried without realizing it, scanning a room before fully breathing in it, keeping the left shoulder slightly open to a door, sounding like the only person in a crisis who was not performing competence for an audience. He then confirmed what she already knew. She had been suspended. He had asked who saved him, and no one had answered directly, which in his experience meant someone was protecting ego. Mara told him he needed rest. He said he needed clarity. Then he used the call sign again, softly but with old authority, and the room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. In another life, that name had traveled through rotor noise, over radios, across black water, and beneath night skies. It had meant steadiness, speed, and trust. She told him he did not have to use that name here. He replied that he did if it remained true. When she asked what he intended to do, he answered like an officer building a plan under pain medication. First, he intended to recover enough to speak in complete sentences. Second, he intended to ask the hospital why a nurse who made the correct call was being treated like a legal hazard. Third, he intended to watch who became nervous. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of hospital leadership and the State Trauma Accreditation Observer, Dr. Miriam Shah. Denise Halbrook, the hospital's COO, entered with polished concern. Evan Coates followed, visibly less smooth than he had been in the morning. Dr. Shah entered with silver hair, intelligent eyes, and the contained stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime listening past excuses. They all noticed Mara immediately. Coates looked as though he had bitten something hard. Halbrook offered relief that Commander Rourke was improving. Rourke ignored the sentiment and went directly to the matter that interested him. He asked who had suspended the nurse who identified his tamponade. Coates attempted the safe phrase, calling it a routine review. Rourke asked for a name. Halbrook admitted that Dr. Pike had initiated concerns with risk consultation. Dr. Shah said very little, but her eyes traveled from Mara to Coates to the chart with the kind of quiet attention that makes careless people sweat. Rourke asked if Mara had been under review before the event. She had not. He asked if there had been prior disciplinary actions. None. He then turned back to the administrators and asked why employment action had preceded event analysis. Coates tried to invoke the profile of the patient and the unusual communication around identity. Rourke cut that apart in a single move by pointing out that his profile had been unknown when she saved him. Dr. Shah then requested the incident timeline, blood release record, ultrasound metadata, and direct witness statements before any further employment action was discussed. Rourke told them to stop treating competence like insubordination until they had reviewed the facts. No one in the room had a clean answer to that. The power in the room changed without any official announcement. It simply became harder to lie comfortably. After that meeting, the hospital began moving around Mara differently, though officially her suspension still stood. Doors stayed open a little longer when she passed. Conversations died mid-sentence. A resident who had once spoken to her with routine condescension stood in the lounge and offered a chair he did not want to admit she no longer needed from him. Dr. Shah began pulling records with the efficiency of a surgeon dissecting tissue from nerve. She reviewed security footage from the trauma bay, requested machine logs, compared charted assessments against attending acknowledgement, and interviewed the paramedic crew separately so no one could calibrate their answers to match institutional preference. Mara did not chase updates. She knew the shape of a real review, and truth takes longer than a lie because it cannot simply choose the convenient version. That evening, sitting alone in a dim waiting alcove outside ICU with coffee gone lukewarm in a paper cup, she let a few older memories surface and pass. They came not as full stories but as flashes. Rotor wash, sand in teeth, blood on fabric that looked black until dawn, a broken radio asking where Ren was. Velez joined her without invitation and told her that certain people had already begun digging into her file after hearing the call sign. Civilian HR had seen what it was meant to see: prior service, nursing bridge program, strong evaluations, voluntary separation. The rest remained where it belonged. Mara asked why he was telling her this. He said Pike had asked around, not smartly, not carefully, but enough. Mara answered that pick. He was the kind of man who heard one unfamiliar word and assumed it was his property. Velez admitted that some personalities scaled perfectly across professions. Then he said what mattered. Rourke had told Dr. Shah only enough to establish that Mara had prior service in acute trauma environments. Vague enough to preserve lines, specific enough to matter. A patient identifying the suspended nurse as uniquely qualified before losing consciousness, Velez said, was helping a great deal. Rourke later asked Mara why she had chosen Charleston. It was not an operational question, but it carried history. Mara answered with the truth trimmed down to what civilian ears could bear. Charleston was full of tourists, old buildings, and people minding their own business. There was water. No one she knew had wanted to live there. She could work without being thanked for things she no longer wanted named. Rourke asked whether she believed silence erased service. She said no. Silence simply let service remain service instead of performance. He remarked that the answer would irritate half his peers. She told him she was recovering faster than he was. Their exchange moved around the old hurt without naming it directly. He observed that they had mocked her. She replied that they had underestimated her, and that mockery was only the decorative, trim, insecure institutions used on that behavior. He then recalled a night over the Black Sea when a pilot lost orientation and panic began trying to organize itself in the cabin. According to him, the worst part had not been the drop or the fumes, but the sound of panic searching for a leader. Then Mara's voice had come over the headset, calm and final, and the entire cabin had remembered how to think. He told her she sounded the same now. She answered that it had been a long time ago. He said that was true for everyone else. As she turned to go, he gave the instruction that set the tone for the next day. When they asked, she was not to protect them from what they had done. She assured him she had no intention of doing so. The expedited internal quality review convened the next morning with all the usual institutional theater that accompanies fear. Mara was invited at 9 and left outside until nearly 9:45. Even the delay was information. Through frosted glass, she heard the rise and fall of familiar voices. Pike, Coates, Halbrook, legal counsel. When Dr. Miriam Shah stepped out briefly and saw Mara waiting, she stopped to comment on the thoroughness of Mara's charting. Mara answered that memory gets accused before paper does. Shah approved of the teaching behind that principle and added before returning inside that the timestamps were not being kind to Mara's attending. When the door finally opened, the conference room presented itself exactly as expected. Too bright, too cold, too orderly. Halbrook sat near the center beside legal counsel and Coates. Pike sat several chairs down, immaculate and composed in the brittle way of a man holding himself together by force. Leela Mercer's shoulders were tight. Two residents at the far end already looked like people reconsidering career fantasies. Shah stood by the wall display with a tablet. Jonah Velez sat unobtrusively off to the side, which only made his presence heavier. One empty chair waited for Mara. Halbrook began with the bureaucratic language of shared mission, factual review, and avoiding assumptions. Mara let it move past her without resistance or engagement. Then Shah touched the screen, and time took over. The timeline appeared without commentary. Arrival, vital signs, chart entries, ultrasound activation, blood release, transfer, surgical findings, security footage followed in grayscale. Everyone watched themselves from a distance, which is often the cruelest form of truth. The stretcher rolling in. Mara bringing in the ultrasound. Pike turning, irritated. No audio yet, but body language already telling the story with indecent clarity. Shah narrated minimally. Mara had charted concern for obstructive physiology at 21:20. Attending acknowledgement of deterioration did not occur until after bedside ultrasound activation. Emergency blood release coincided with documented hemodynamic collapse. Surgical findings later confirmed both cardiac tamponade and abdominal hemorrhage. Pike objected that the sequence was incomplete without clinical context. Shah invited him to provide it. Pike then reached for the language he knew best, the language of hierarchy and institutional necessity. Trauma care required structure, he said. Hospitals could not function if every nurse independently escalated diagnostics and transfusion pathways based on partial impressions. Mara asked whether the finding had truly been partial. Shah allowed the interruption. Pike insisted that nursing assessments were not physician diagnoses. Mara answered that they were often the reason physician diagnoses happened in time. A resident studied the table as if it had become suddenly fascinating. Pike claimed Mara's tone had been disruptive and that junior staff had become uncertain who was directing care. Shah called in trauma tech Holloway and asked directly whether confusion had existed in the room. Holloway answered honestly that initially Pike had been directing, but after Mara identified the tamponade, both were moving, and Mara was the one anticipating the sequence. It had not felt confusing. It had felt fast. Then came paramedic Reyes, still in uniform, still carrying the neutrality of someone outside hospital politics. Shah asked who first voiced concern for obstructive signs. Reyes answered without hesitation that it had been Mara. Shah asked whether her concern had sounded reckless. Reyes said no because she had sounded like she knew what she was looking at. Pike objected that paramedics were not credentialed to evaluate in-hospital supervisory dynamics. Reyes replied that while that might be true, paramedics were credentialed to recognize when someone noticed a dying patient before the room caught up. The blood bank log followed and showed emergency release under crash protocol rather than unauthorized improvisation. Then Shah produced corridor audio, not perfect but clear enough to preserve Pike's dismissive line about letting the physicians diagnose the trauma. Silence spread coldly through the room. Halbrook looked at Coates. Coates looked at no one. Leela Mercer attempted to save ground by claiming that even if Mara's concerns were validated, they did not erase a broader pattern of defiance. Shah turned and asked where that pattern was documented. There were no prior corrective actions, no written counseling, no adverse events linked to Mara. Shah stated she was reluctant to call proven initiative a pattern. For much of this, Mara did not speak because she no longer needed to. The records and witnesses were speaking on her behalf with far more force than anger ever could. Then the door opened, and Commander Elias Rourke entered in a wheelchair, pale, visibly exhausted, one shoulder braced, an ICU nurse behind him who clearly believed the outing was medically unwise. Velez rose but did not interfere. Halbrook half stood and began objecting to his presence. Rourke stopped her with a glance and positioned himself at the end of the table. He said he would not stay long, but his arrival had already detonated whatever remained of the room's manageable fiction. He did not deliver a dramatic speech. He asked questions, each one slower than comfortable and impossible to brush aside. Who had suspended her? On what evidence? Before or after the machine timestamps were reviewed? Before or after witness statements were taken? Before or after it became clear that he had identified her? Coates tried to hide behind the distinction between patient appreciation and employment matters. Rourke answered that this was not appreciation but causality. Then he looked at Mara and asked if she wanted him to explain how he knew her. She told him to stay within the lines. He obliged. Years ago, he said, before Mara entered civilian medicine, she had served in acute combat casualty environments under conditions irrelevant to hospital public relations and unavailable for gossip. What mattered was that he had personally watched her identify lethal physiological changes in conditions far worse than a rain-soaked trauma bay, and that her judgment under pressure was exceptional. Pike tried to separate military experience from civilian authority, noting that the former did not automatically confer the latter. Rourke agreed, and then added the line that broke Pike's last refuge. Saving his life had conferred it that night. Rourke explained that when he arrived in the trauma bay, he was not coherent enough to negotiate anyone's ego, but he had been coherent enough to recognize the one person in the room whose calm he had trusted before. He had called her by call sign. She had identified his condition before the attending acted. Those were facts, not interpretations. Up to that point, Pike had been trying to frame the issue as clinical nuance, communication style, or administrative overreaction. Facts spoken by the saved patient in front of leadership and an inspector were something else entirely. They were structure, and structure collapses differently than pride. Halbrook thanked Rourke and called the clarification helpful in a tone that made the word sound flimsy even to her own ears. Shah asked whether his recognition of Mara was historical or contemporaneous. He answered that it was both. Historical from prior service, contemporaneous because people under pressure often revert to the last voice they remember as reliable. Pike made one last attempt, insisting that hospitals could not function if support staff overrode attendings whenever they disagreed. Mara turned to him then and answered with the full steadiness of someone who had run out of patience without losing control. She had not Agreed, she said. She had recognized a lethal finding that he ignored. He told her to be careful. She told him he had already received enough careful from everyone around him. Then she laid the sequence out with devastating simplicity. She had asked twice for ultrasound and been dismissed twice. The patient had called her by a name she had not used in years, and even that had not shaken his certainty. He moved only when the screen forced him to. After surgery confirmed exactly what she saw, he thanked the team and suspended her before breakfast. If the room wanted to discuss hierarchy, then it needed to discuss what hierarchy was for. It existed to organize expertise, not to protect vanity. The moment it punished accurate escalation, it stopped being medicine and became theater. That sentence changed the room more than any credential could have. One of the residents looked at Mara as if he were hearing the entire profession explained honestly for the first time. Pike called her statement outrageous. She asked whether it was inaccurate. He had no answer ready enough to survive the silence that followed. Shah then stated plainly that retaliatory discipline following validated safety escalation posed a serious concern in any accredited trauma environment. Coates protested that no retaliation had been intended. Shah replied that intent was not the only metric that mattered. Halbrook, finally recognizing the calculus clearly enough, closed her folder and announced that Mara's suspension was rescinded effective, immediately pending final written review. Mara showed no visible reaction. Halbrook then informed Pike that, until the review concluded, he would step back from supervisory authority in emergency trauma cases. Pike objected that the measure was punitive. Shah corrected him. It was prudent. Leela Mercer attempted to argue that the hospital should not overcorrect, and Halbrook turned on her next, stating that her participation in a pre-review suspension decision would also be assessed. Rourke, exhausted but still capable of dry precision, remarked that they were finally using nouns correctly. Even Shah almost smiled. The hearing ended not with applause or vindication, but with the heavier, more satisfying silence that falls when pretense loses legal cover. The formal reveal of Mara's past did not happen before the committee. It happened later, in a smaller room under more respectful conditions. Dr. Shah asked for a private debrief, partly for accreditation context, and partly because she was experienced enough to know when a history was sitting quietly in front of her waiting to be acknowledged without spectacle. The room was small, with one window and a dead pot of coffee. Shah made clear that she did not need operational details and was not asking for stories dressed up as heroics. She needed only enough to understand why Mara's judgment looked the way it did. Mara considered her and answered obliquely at first. Had Shah ever heard a rhythm change before the monitor truly showed it? Shah admitted that sometimes she had. Mara said that was the closest simple description. Shah observed that such perception sounded like scar tissue, not ordinary training. Mara allowed that it was usually both. Then, because the day had already split open her anonymity, and because Shah had earned the truth in the right measure, Mara gave enough. She had served as a Navy corpsman before becoming a registered nurse. She had worked in acute combat casualty environments where noise discipline mattered as much as hand speed, where color changes had to be read under red light, where pressure could be heard in someone's breathing while engines screamed. The call sign Ren had not been chosen by her. It had been given by men who were bleeding and sarcastic and trusted her to notice what others missed. She left service, completed the bridge into civilian nursing, and made a deliberate decision not to trade the mythology of that past for standing in her present. She wanted to be judged by what she did in the room, not by stories attached to it. Shah asked if that was what had happened. Mara answered that instead she had been judged, according to what a quiet woman was assumed incapable of having done before she entered the room. When Shah later mentioned that Commander Rourke had said he recognized something in Mara beyond simple competence, the meaning was clear. He had not merely recognized her face. He had recognized an old pattern of reliability that survives time, rank, and reinvention. That recognition mattered not because it was military, but because it exposed how shallow everyone else's assumptions had been. Mara had spent nearly a year at St. Catherine being categorized as quiet, efficient, technically strong, socially absent, useful as long as she remembered her place. The emergency department had tested her quickly and decided on day 3 that she was not a threat if kept inside the boundaries they chose for her. They mistook R. Serve for emptiness, gentleness for softness, and calm for passivity. They noticed she wrapped pressure dressings too fast, secured lines with unusual precision, cleared blind corners instinctively, anticipated the arrival of flight crews before the radio called down, and kept almost nothing personal in her locker. Yet even those signs had been filtered through lazy assumptions. People joked that if she were military, everyone would know because military people always announced themselves. Mara had heard those jokes and said nothing because silence protected the life she wanted. She lived alone above a bakery on Meeting Street, ran before dawn, kept blackout curtains, slept lightly, never let anyone walk her to her car, and avoided every modern habit that blurred privacy into performance. The most misleading thing about her in the eyes of the hospital was the quality they publicly praised. She was gentle, not hesitant or meek, but genuinely gentle. She lowered elderly patients onto stretchers like they were made of dignity as much as bone. She placed IVs without turning skill into self-display. She spoke to frightened adults the way others remembered to speak only to children. In a place where volume often masqueraded as competence, gentleness looked like weakness to people who had never learned the difference. The days that followed were quieter but more consequential than the dramatic hearing itself. Once the timeline existed in official language, consequences could no longer be contained to hallway whispers. Pike remained formally employed, but the easy orbit he had once commanded began to fracture. Residents who had copied his manner too closely now kept a little distance, uncertain whether arrogance still read as power when so publicly exposed. Leela Mercer found that bureaucratic injury worked less effectively under scrutiny. Coates spent more time in meetings than on the floor. Halbrook became careful in the way administrators become careful when they realize a problem may travel upward faster than they can shape it. Dr. Shah continued her review with relentless focus, examining not only Mara's case, but broader patterns of escalation culture within the trauma service. Were nurses able to voice concerns safely? Were dissenting clinical observations documented and respected? Was hierarchy serving care or protecting prestige? Once those questions are formally asked, institutions rarely enjoy the answers. Mara returned to work without ceremony because that was all she wanted. There was no reinstatement speech, no applause, no visible repentance. Some people apologized awkwardly, usually in fragments, usually while pretending they were only clarifying a misunderstanding. Mara accepted none of those offerings as medicine. She did not punish them either. She simply returned to the work and let consistency do what it always had. Families still received her gentleness. Frightened patients still received her steadiness. Difficult cases still found her attention before they found anyone else's ego. The difference now was that the room had been forced to redraw its map around her. She was no longer the quiet nurse people could overlook safely. She was the person who had already seen a dying man more clearly than the attending, and everyone knew it. Rourke recovered by degrees in ICU and then stepped down, irritation at immobility returning faster than color, which Velez took as a favorable sign. Mara did not linger at his bedside more than necessary. Their connection was real, but neither of them had any appetite for melodrama. He asked once whether Charleston was still working for her. She said mostly. He noted that mostly was an improvement over survival. She allowed that point. He asked if she intended to stay at St. Catherine. She answered that leaving because lesser people were embarrassed by her competence would be a poor use of principle. He seemed satisfied by that. Velez, on the other hand, admitted one evening in the hallway that watching Pike's expression during the review had provided a level of satisfaction he was prepared to classify as therapeutic. Mara told him that was a dangerously officer-like assessment. He told her she still sounded like someone who heard the exit alarm before it rang. Rourke was eventually cleared for transfer under military coordination, but before he left, he found a moment to speak to Mara without audience. He thanked her in the plainest language possible, which meant more coming from him than anything ornate would have. She told him he would have done the same for anyone on his table. He answered that was not the point. The point, he said, was that some people spent years proving who they were while others spent years refusing to see it. She had done both and still chosen to remain gentle. That, in his view, was rarer than courage. Mara did not know how to answer that, so she settled for telling him to heal properly and stop making ICU nurses regret their professional ethics. After he left, the hospital resumed its ordinary emergencies, which is both the comfort and cruelty of medicine. Nothing remains dramatic for long under fluorescent lights. Hook injuries returned. Tourists panicked over chest pain that turned out to be indigestion. Children split their chins on pool decks. Septic patients arrived gray and wordless. Families wept. Administrators issued memos. Shift change happened. Once in a while, in the middle of a hard night, someone new would glance at Mara after she noticed something early, and there would be a flicker of recognition there, not of her past, but of her actual shape in the present. Residents began asking her what she was seeing instead of assuming they knew. One even admitted with painful honesty that the hearing had changed the way he understood the role of nursing in trauma care. Mara told him it should change the way he understood hierarchy, not just nursing. Another nurse quietly thanked her for not letting the suspension stand without challenge, because people notice when retaliation works and when it does not. Dr. Shah's final recommendations, though circulated above Mara's pay grade, produced visible changes. Escalation pathways were clarified, protected reporting language strengthened. Bedside ultrasound access in trauma was reviewed. Pike's supervisory status did not recover to what it had been. Whether he would ever truly understand what had undone him remained doubtful. Men like him often believe their downfall began with disobedience, when in fact it began much earlier, the moment they started treating competence in others as a personal insult. Charleston remained Charleston through all of it, indifferent in the healthy way cities often are. The harbor kept catching dawn light as if nothing human had ever broken beneath it. Tourists still filled the old streets with cameras and brunch plans. The bakery downstairs still sent up the smell of sugar and yeast in the early morning. Mara continued to run before sunrise, continued to keep blackout curtains, continued to sleep lightly and live without ornament. The cedar box stayed on the closet shelf where it belonged. The coin remained in its pouch. The name Wren returned to silence, though not to erasure. Now and then, when the department settled into that dangerous rhythm of speed without attention, Mara would hear a shift in the room before anyone else did. A breathing pattern, a monitor tone, a silence too heavy to be fatigue alone. She would turn, step in, and make the call. Sometimes people listened immediately. Sometimes they needed another second. But never again did they dismiss her quite the same way. Not because one hearing had made everyone noble, but because reality had become expensive to ignore. What remained most striking about the entire affair was not the rescue itself, or even the institutional reckoning that followed. It was the fact that the person everyone had been most comfortable underestimating turned out to be the one carrying the deepest reserve of skill, discipline, and earned calm in the building. Myra had never needed the hospital to know where she came from in order to do her work well. She had only needed them not to punish her for doing it correctly. In the end, that was the truth that outlasted gossip, memos, and administrative language. The most dangerous thing in the trauma bay that night had not been blood in the pericardium or fluid in the abdomen. It had been ego dressed as order. Mara saw that too, just as clearly as she saw the neck veins and the narrowing pressure, and she acted anyway. That was why Elia's work lived. That was why the suspension failed. That was why the room changed. And that was why, long after the official review closed, and the hospital found fresher scandals to feed on, the people who had been there remembered the night less as the one when a high-profile patient nearly died, and more as the night a quiet nurse stopped an institution in its tracks simply by refusing to let medicine become theater.